The mud in Cheyenne that spring of 1884 was a particular kind of misery. It was not the honest mud of a farmer's field, but a greedy, ambitious slurry of clay, horse manure, and crushed ambition, clinging to the boots of every man who walked the boardwalks. James Alderton felt it clung to his soul. At 38, his name was a currency more stable than the paper dollars changing hands in the saloons. Alderton. It meant cattle, it meant land stretching from the Laramie River to the Nebraska border, and it meant a 2-story mansion on the hill overlooking the raw, striving town, a house filled with polished wood and Belgian lace and a silence that grew louder every year. He sat in the parlor of Mr. Thaddeus Warren, a man whose primary business was the careful cultivation of influence. Mr. Warren's daughter, Elizabeth, was playing the pianoforte. She was a handsome woman, with hair the color of dark honey and a posture perfected by years of discipline. She played well. She did everything well. James held a glass of whiskey he did not want and listened to a piece by Chopin he did not care for. He knew this ritual. He had performed it with the daughters of the territory's most powerful men. The pattern was always the same. The initial pleasantries, the careful display of feminine accomplishment, the subtle, or not so subtle, cataloging of his assets through polite conversation. He had watched Elizabeth's eyes, clear and intelligent, sweep over his tailored suit, his polished boots, the rumored acres and herds that stood invisibly behind him in the room. She was not a grasping woman. She was practical. She was assessing a potential merger, the joining of 2 great houses. He was not a man. He was a holding. She has a fine touch, does she not? Mr. Warren's voice was smooth, oiled like the action on a new rifle. A very fine touch, James agreed. He looked at the girl's hands on the keys, competent and sure. He felt a profound and weary sadness. He excused himself not long after, pleading the necessity of an early start. He had to ride out to one of the western camps, a journey of 2 days. The prospect of the open plains, even under the threat of weather, felt like a release. The weather, when it came, was not a threat but a declaration of war. The sky, which had been a placid, unassuming blue, turned the color of a bruise. The clouds gathered like a vast, dark army, and the wind began to keen. James was still miles from any shelter when the first drops, cold and heavy as coins, began to fall. The road dissolved into a treacherous river of mud, the same mud as Cheyenne but wilder, more honest in its intent to strand a man. He was guiding the team through a particularly nasty wash when he heard the sound. A sickening crack, a sharp lurch, and the wagon slumped to one side like a shot animal. The axle. He swore, a low and bitter sound swallowed by the rising wind. He was a wealthy man, a powerful man, and he was utterly, comprehensively stuck. The rain came down in a torrent, soaking him to the bone in seconds. There was nothing for it but to unhitch the horses and wait. He huddled under the useless canvas of the wagon, the cold seeping into his joints, and felt a grim, ironic humor. The master of 1,000 acres defeated by a stick of wood and some water. He did not know how long he sat there, listening to the drum of the rain, before he heard another sound. It was not the wind. It was the rhythmic squelch of boots, steady and determined, and a low voice giving a command. Through the gray sheet of rain, a figure emerged, and then another. The first was a young woman. She was not tall, but she stood as if she were planted and solid. She wore a man's oilskin coat over her dress, the hem of which was dark with mud. A sodden braid of brown hair lay over her shoulder. Her face was plain, which was to say it was a face built for purpose and not for show, with a strong jaw and eyes the color of a winter sky. Beside her was a boy, perhaps 16, with the same determined set to his mouth. He carried a coil of thick rope. They stopped a few yards from his wagon. The woman's gaze was not on him, but on the broken axle, the tilted wheel, the whole sorry picture of his predicament. She assessed it with a quiet, professional competence. "Axles snapped clean," she said, her voice clear and low, carrying easily over the storm. It was not a question. "It appears so," James managed. She looked at him then, a quick, dismissive glance. He was just another part of the problem to be solved. "Thomas," she said to the boy, "fetch the draft team. We'll need the heavy chain, not the rope." The boy nodded and vanished back into the gloom. "You'll have to unhitch your team," she said to James. It was an order. He found himself moving to obey without a second thought. He was used to giving orders, not taking them, but there was a quality of calm certainty in her voice that allowed for no argument. Together, in the driving rain, they worked. Or rather, she worked, and he assisted. She directed the placement of his horses, the way to brace the wagon, the precise angle to attach the chain when the boy returned with two enormous, steaming draft horses. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in close negotiation with the physical world. She never wasted a step, never made a false move. He, on the other hand, felt clumsy and useless, his fine suit ruined, his hands soft and inept next to hers. It took the better part of an hour, a grueling, mud-caked eternity, but they pulled the wagon free and dragged it, listing, down the road to a small, tidy farmstead. A plume of smoke rose from the chimney of the house, a promise of warmth in the gray misery. "You can leave the wagon in the barn," she said, pointing. "The roof leaks on the west side, so keep it to the east." Inside the barn, out of the wind, the world seemed to settle. The air smelled of hay and animals and damp earth. James watched her as she and the boy unhitched the draft team, their movements synchronized and familiar. She ran a hand down the flank of one of the massive horses, a gesture of affection and respect. "I am in your debt," James said, his voice sounding formal and strange in the rustic quiet. He reached into his coat, his hand going for his wallet. "I'd like to pay you for your time and the use of your team." She turned to him. For the first time, she really looked at him, and her eyes, which had been focused on tasks, now focused on his face. There was no recognition. There was only a faint, sharp appraisal. She looked at his hand, then back to his face. "We don't take money for helping a neighbor," she said. The words were simple, but they carried the force of a locked door. "But I'm not your neighbor," he protested. "I was just passing through." "Road runs past our land," she said, as if that explained everything. "You're cold and wet. Supper's on. You can eat with us." Again, it was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact. The farmhouse kitchen was a single large room, dominated by a cast-iron stove and a long, scrubbed pine table. It was warm and bright. A younger girl, who looked to be about 10, was setting out plates. The room was sparse, the furniture worn with use, but it was impeccably clean. It felt more like a home than his mansion ever had. He was given a place at the table. The meal was beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, and fresh bread with churned butter. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. He ate in silence, listening to the small talk between the siblings. Thomas, Rose, and the little one, Mary. Their father, they explained, was in town for supplies, caught by the same storm. "The price of corn is a crime," Rose said suddenly, looking at him. "What they pay us and what they charge in town are two different worlds." James, caught off guard, found himself defending the principles of supply and demand, the cost of transport, the merchant's risk. He spoke as he would to one of his business partners in Cheyenne. She listened, her fork poised, a small, skeptical frown on her face. "That's what a man with a full belly and a warm coat says," she countered. "It sounds different when you're the one whose sweat is being sold for pennies on the dollar." They argued, not with hostility, but with the focused energy of two people who believed they were right. He was struck by the force of her intellect. She was sharp, logical, and completely unintimidated by him. He was not James Alderton, the cattle baron. He was just a nameless, stranded man with opinions she found lacking. It was exhilarating. It was only when the storm had passed and he was preparing to ride one of his own horses into the nearest town to arrange for a new axle that the subject of his identity finally came up. "We never did get your name," the boy, Thomas, said. "It's James," he said. He hesitated, then added, "James Alderton." He watched for the change. He had seen it 100 times. The flicker of avarice, the sudden deference, the recalculation in the eyes. Thomas's eyes went wide. "Alderton? Of the Alderton Cattle Company?" But Rose's expression did not change. She was wiping the table with a damp cloth, her movements still steady and deliberate. She paused, looked at him, and a small, wry smile touched her lips. "Well, Mr. Alderton," she said, "for a man who owns half of Wyoming, you know precious little about the price of corn." And with that, she turned back to her work, leaving him standing there, feeling as if the world had just shifted on its foundations. He found reasons to return. The first was legitimate. He sent a man with a new wagon and a generous side of beef, a practical gift he hoped would not offend. The man reported that Miss Callum had accepted it with a nod and a simple, "Tell him thank you." But that was not enough. He found himself manufacturing excuses. A fence line he needed to inspect that just happened to border the Callums' rented land. A stray calf he was searching for that had, improbably, wandered miles from its herd. Each time he would see her. She would be in the yard mending a harness or in the garden, her hands deep in the dark soil. She always greeted him with the same level-headed calm. A nod. A quiet, "Mr. Alderton." She never seemed surprised to see him, nor did she seem particularly pleased. She simply accepted his presence as she accepted the rising of the sun or the turning of the seasons. One afternoon, he found her staring up at the barn roof, a frown on her face. The patch where the leak had been was worse. "The man I sent to fix your axle was supposed to patch that," he said, annoyed. "He did," she said. "He patched it like a man who gets paid whether the roof leaks or not. It was an opportunity." "I can fix that," he declared, with more confidence than he felt. "I've built a barn or two in my time." This was a lie. He had paid for barns to be built. He had never held the hammer himself. Her skepticism was a palpable thing. "Do you know which end of the hammer to hold?" she asked, her tone dry. "Of course," he said, stung. He spent the next hour proving that he did not. He climbed the ladder with a pouch of nails and a hammer that felt foreign and clumsy in his hand. He missed the nailhead, hitting his thumb with a muffled curse. He drove another nail in at an angle, splitting the shingle. He was making it worse. He heard a sound below and looked down. She was standing at the base of the ladder, her arms crossed. There was a ghost of a smile on her face, not of mockery, but of something else. Amusement. Fondness, perhaps. He was not sure. She climbed the ladder, her movements as sure and easy as his had been awkward. She did not say a word. She simply took the hammer from his hand, her fingers brushing his. Her hand was rough, calloused, but warm. The touch was brief, electric. "Watch," she said. She turned his hand over, the one holding the nail, and adjusted his grip. "Hold it steady. Don't be afraid of it." Then she placed the hammer back in his other hand, repositioning his fingers on the handle. "And don't try to kill it. Let the weight of the hammer do the work." She guided his first swing. The hammer struck the nail head squarely. A second, a third, and the nail was driven home, clean and true. He looked at the nail. He looked at her. She was very close. He could see the flecks of gold in her winter sky eyes, smell the faint scent of soap and sunshine on her skin. The world narrowed to the space of that rooftop, the warm wood beneath them, the vast, empty sky above. She was not going to be the one to say any of this first. He knew it then. He knew it with a certainty that had nothing to do with ledgers or land titles. All the drawing rooms in Cheyenne, all the polished conversations and calculated smiles, they were dust. This was real. The quiet competence, the shared work, the way she looked at him not as James Alderton, but as a man who needed to be shown how to hold a hammer. What he had been missing was not a wife who admired his fortune, but a woman who ignored it entirely. He started spending more time at the farm than in his office. He learned the rhythm of the place. He learned to mend a fence properly, to milk a cow without getting kicked, to appreciate the profound satisfaction of a day's hard physical labor. He ate at their table, listening to the family's chatter, feeling a sense of belonging that his own grand house had never given him. He and Rose rarely spoke of anything important. They talked about the weather, the health of the livestock, the progress of the crops. But in the quiet moments, in the shared glances over a task, in the comfortable silence that grew between them, something else was being said. A whole conversation was taking place, unspoken and profound. The spell was broken by a letter from Cheyenne. His business partner, Silas Croft, requested his immediate presence. The tone was urgent. James rode back into town, feeling like a man returning from a foreign country. The noise, the ambition, the sheer striving of the place grated on him. His mansion felt cold, impossibly large and empty. Silas did not waste time with pleasantries. He was a man made of sharp angles and sharper calculations. "James, where have you been? People are talking." "Let them talk," James said, pouring himself a brandy. "They are saying you've lost your senses, that you're spending your days on a tenant farm with a farmer's daughter." Silas's voice was laced with disbelief and disapproval. "This is not a game. We have the railroad expansion to consider. The Warrens are key. An alliance through marriage. Silas, I am not a piece of property to be traded. No, you are the man who holds all the property." Silas shot back, his frustration boiling over. "And you are acting like a fool. Do you have any idea what they will do to that girl? The women in this town, the ones you have slighted, they will shred her. They will call her a grasping, ambitious country girl who trapped you. They will make her life a living hell. Is that what you want for her?" The words hit James like a physical blow, because he knew they were true. He had seen the quiet cruelties of Cheyenne society. He imagined Rose, with her plain-spoken honesty and her sturdy pride, subjected to the whispers and the cold shoulders of women like Elizabeth Warren's mother. He imagined her spirit, so bright and independent, being chipped away by their casual malice. He could not bear it. And so, in a misguided attempt to be honorable, he did the most dishonorable thing of all. He made a decision for her. To protect her, he would withdraw. He would let the connection wither, let the talk die down. He would retreat back into his world, and she would be safe in hers. He stopped visiting. He sent no word. He imagined her confusion, her hurt, and it was a constant dull ache in his chest. But it was for the best, he told himself. He was protecting her. He was being a gentleman. He attended a dinner at the Warrens. Elizabeth was gracious. Her father was expansive. The deal for the railroad seemed all but done. James moved through the evening like a ghost, his smiles hollow, his conversation automatic. He was praised for his good sense, for returning to his obligations. He had never felt more like a fraud. Section: What country are you listening from? It's always a thrill to see how far these stories travel. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, let's get back to the story. He was standing on the veranda of his mansion 3 days later, staring out at the lights of the town he had helped build, when he saw the rider. A lone figure, coming up the long drive, not with the deference of a messenger or the swagger of a guest, but with a straight-backed, unhurried purpose. Even at a distance, he knew. It was Rose. She dismounted at the base of the wide marble steps, tying her horse to the polished brass rail as if it were a common fence post. She did not look at the grand facade of the house, at the columns, the tall windows. Her eyes were fixed on him. She walked up the steps, her worn boots making a solid, uncompromising sound on the marble. She stopped before him, her face pale in the twilight, her expression unreadable. "This is a big house," she said. It was a simple observation, devoid of awe or envy. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse. She looked him in the eye. Her gaze was as clear and direct as it had been on the day they met. "I have a question for you, Mr. Alderton," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of the long miles she had ridden. "Are you in the habit of making decisions about my life without troubling to consult me?" The question hung in the air between them, sharp and clean as a shard of glass. He had no answer. All his justifications, all his carefully constructed reasons about protecting her, they crumbled to dust under the simple force of her integrity. He had treated her like one of the Cheyenne women, a delicate flower to be shielded. He had forgotten who she was, the woman who pulled his wagon from the mud, who taught him how to hold a hammer, who was afraid of nothing. "I thought," he began, but the words died in his throat. "You thought," she said, and there was a deep, weary sadness in her voice now. "You thought for me. You decided for me. You did not think to ask me if I was afraid of a few gossiping women. You did not think to ask me what I wanted." She took a breath. "You were not protecting me, Mr. Alderton. You were protecting yourself from a choice." She turned without waiting for a reply and walked back down the steps. He watched her mount her horse and ride away, a small, solitary figure swallowed by the vastness of his manicured lawns and the encroaching dark. He was alone. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the big house pressing in on him. Then he turned and walked inside. For the next 3 days, he did not leave. He walked the echoing halls, from the grand ballroom to the cavernous dining room, from the library filled with books he never read to the master bedroom with its cold, empty hearth. He looked at the portraits of his ancestors, at the heavy velvet curtains, at the polished silver. These were the things the other women had admired. They had seen the house, the fortune, the power. Rose had seen a man who didn't know how to fix a roof. He remembered his father. A hard man, but not an unkind one. He had married James's mother for her family's connections, a strategic alliance that had doubled their holdings. It had been a quiet, respectable, and deeply lonely marriage. His father had built an empire, but he had never built a home. He had died in a big house, surrounded by servants, a wealthy and successful man who was utterly alone. And James saw, with a sudden, soul-shaking clarity, that he was repeating his father's mistake, just in kinder language. Silas spoke of alliances, of duty, of practicality. But it was the same trap. Marrying for advantage, not for partnership. Choosing a holding instead of a heart. Rose had not offered him admiration. She had offered him honesty. She had not offered him deference. She had offered him partnership. She had offered him what no one else could, a place where he did not have to be James Alderton, the cattle baron, but simply James, a man who was loved not for the empire he commanded, but for the man he was when he fumbled with a hammer. On the third morning, he knew what he had to do. There was no more thought, no more hesitation. He did not bother to send a man. He saddled his own horse and rode. He found her at the fence line separating her family's land from the wild prairie beyond. She was repairing a section of the fence, her movements sure and economical, just as they had been the first day he saw her. He dismounted and walked toward her, the dry grass crunching under his boots. She did not look up until he was standing just on the other side of the fence. She paused, her hand resting on a post. She waited. "Rose," he began, and his voice was rough. He cleared his throat. I have been a fool. A flicker of something in her eyes. She remained silent. A slow, blind fool, he continued, the words coming in a rush now that they had started. You were right. I was protecting myself. I was afraid, not of what they would do to you, but of what I would have to become if I chose you. I would have to be a better man than I am. He looked at her strong, capable hands, at the steady light in her eyes. I am done being a fool, Rose. I am done being slow. He took a breath, the biggest of his life. I don't want to visit you anymore. I would like to stay. Here. With you. As your husband. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the grass. He waited, his heart pounding a heavy, clumsy rhythm against his ribs. She looked down at the fence post, then back up at him. A slow smile spread across her face, a real smile, one that reached her eyes and made them shine like the summer sky. Well, she said, her voice soft with a gentle, loving mockery. You got there. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Is that a yes? It's a yes, she said. Obviously, yes. The courtship was brief and practical. There were no flowery poems or expensive gifts. Instead, there were shared meals at the long pine table, with James slowly learning the names and personalities of Rose's younger siblings. There were long walks on Sundays, not along Cheyenne's manicured promenades, but along the property lines of the farm, their talk not of society or business, but of crop rotation and the prospect of buying the land they stood on. He worked alongside her and her family, his hands slowly growing calloused, his body learning the satisfying ache of real labor. He was happier than he had ever been. Their wedding was not a Cheyenne society event. It was held in the small clapboard church in the nearest town. Rose wore a simple dress of blue cotton, one she had made herself, and in her hair were a few wildflowers Mary had picked that morning. James stood beside her, feeling more solid and real than he ever had in his fine suits. The whole town, it seemed, was there. The farmers, the blacksmith, the general store owner. They were her people. And he was beginning to understand they were his people now, too. 7 years later. The house was new, but it was not a mansion. It was a solid, well-built farmhouse, with a wide porch that looked out over fields that were their own. James sat on the top step of that porch in the warm evening light, attempting to fix a loose board. He still wasn't very good at it. A small boy with his father's quiet eyes and a serious expression sat beside him, handing him nails. A little girl with her mother's determined chin and a braid of brown hair was chasing chickens in the yard, her laughter bright and clear. The screen door creaked open and Rose came out. She carried 2 cups of coffee. She watched him for a moment as he lined up a nail, swung the hammer, and missed, striking the wood with a dull thud. She smiled that same smile he remembered from the barn roof all those years ago. She handed him a cup and sat down beside him. Still haven't learned, she said, her voice warm with love. He took the hammer from his other hand and set it down, wrapping his fingers around the warm mug instead. He looked at her, at the woman who was the anchor of his life. He looked at their children playing in the yard, at the fields stretching out before them, at the home they had built with their own hands. No, he said, his own smile finally meeting hers. But I'm learning. That's the thing about humor and banter, isn't it? It's not just about being clever. It's about respect. When 2 people can argue about the price of corn or the right way to hold a hammer, what they're really doing is testing the beams of a house they might build together. They're seeing if the foundation is strong enough for honesty. They're seeing if there's room enough for 2 minds to live inside, not just one. It's intimacy, in its most practical and enduring form. Thank you for writing with me today. I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, keep writing.